You really can't help being a racist, you know. It's sort of an occupational hazard of being human. I can't imagine that there are too many people in the history of the world who have escaped it entirely, although there are surely some great people who have put it away from themselves, but they must have been at one time. Jesus was probably a racist at one point in his life. Now, does that sound inflammatory or controversial? Have you heard that before? Well, I'm going to stay with it, but let me say two things about that. First of all, Jesus grew up in a world that was every bit as racist as our own world, perhaps more so. He grew up in a culture that placed a strong premium on cultural purity, on racial purity, and that included a strong sense of racial identity. Jesus grew up, as you know, Jewish, and Judaism then was, and still can be, identified both as a religion and as a race. Most of the pictures that we have of Jesus show him to be a blue-eyed blonde, pretty blonde, which Jesus certainly was very unlikely to be the case. He was not of Northern European extraction, although if you Google images of Jesus, you're going to think maybe so. But Jesus was actually a Middle Eastern Jew, and that's what he looked like. And there was a dominant view in Jesus' time that Jews were supposed to keep themselves pure and their race pure from others. It was accepting the views of and cultural practices of other races that got them into trouble in the first place, they believed, because it took them away from their calling to be God's pure people. And they were an occupied nation at the time with a puppet government, and many would say that they had been punished for turning away from Yahweh by having these occupiers in their land. Therefore, it was necessary, they believed, to avoid falling into the trap of becoming like the people around them. They had to avoid them. They had to work to not accept the ways of other cultures. Now, what do you think? Do you think that translated at times into racism? How is it possible for us to say to another group, we must not become like you, without slipping into, there's something wrong with you? We would become very aware of all of the differences between us, and especially if they happen to be a military power camped in our land that we were trying not to become like. So we would be thinking about that a lot. We would know that they are others. They are others. They are other than us, and probably bad, and probably defective, maybe less than us, maybe subhuman. And that's the world that Jesus grew up in. And it would have been taught to him as well. Well, you know, even if Mary and Joseph held no animosity towards other people, Jesus would have picked it up from the attitudes of the people in his town. Just imagine this. Imagine that Jesus and other children from the village of Nazareth are playing together somewhere in the town. And a stranger happens by, maybe a traveler, or maybe he's a resident of Nazareth, a business owner who is not Jewish. Or what happens then when the children look at that person that their parents identify as one of them? Maybe they stop and stare. Even if they don't say anything, they might have some of that sense. What if, as Jesus and his children are playing together, a Roman soldier happens to pass by, and the children stop and they watch him go? And then one of the kids, one of the children says, "There goes one of those dirty Romans." And that means it's time to play a game. It's time to play not cops and robbers, not cowboys and Indians, but Romans and Jews. And none of the kids wants to be one of the dirty Romans, right? You want to be the good guys, not the bad guys. That kind of thing has got to begin to seep into the consciousness of any child growing up in that town. Racism was in the air that Jesus breathed when he was a child. If you believe that Jesus was a real human being, and by the way, if you don't, we may have to burn you at the stake, or at least we might have at some point in history. If you believe that Jesus was a real human being, then you have to believe that he would have begun to absorb the attitudes of the community in which he lived. Jesus would have, as a child, picked up some of the racist attitudes that were everywhere in his world. Now, he got rid of them later on, as we shall see, but at one point they must have been there, and guess what? The same thing happens to us. We have also been raised in a racist world. It's part of the air we breathe. It's part of the thoughts that we think. Because of this, it's not always something that we are aware of, because we just kind of absorbed it. How many of you have a tendency to not pronounce the R at the end of a word, as in ka? How many of you have referred to Pastor Carnahan as if there's no R in there? Have you done that? Where did you learn to do that? Who taught you to minimize the sound of the R in your language? Who taught you? Mary, where's Mary? There you are. You lived in Maine all your life. Who taught you that?
It just was common nature of what you heard.
It was what you heard. It was just around us, and we absorbed it. And we do the same thing with ideas. We just breathe it in, and then we breathe it out. This is one of the things that we have to deal with in our society. I want to give you some stories from my own life to exemplify this. Because the racism is just in the air. Now, first I want to talk about Julia, and then I want to talk about Myrtle, and then I want to talk about Gilbert. In 1968, when I was 14, there was a television show called Julia, which was extremely popular. Besides me, who remembers? Okay, there was something significant about that show. Does anyone know what it was? What was it, Ray? Yes, it was the first time a television show had a black person, an African-American person, in the lead role. Diane Carroll played the part of Julia. And it was a popular show. Now, my grandparents were visiting one day. I had grandparents with real grandparent names. My father's parents were Kent and Bertha. That sounds like grandparents, doesn't it? And my mother's parents even more sounded like grandparents. They were Archie and Myrtle. And Myrtle was a soft-spoken, quiet, gentle person. She didn't have much hatred for anybody in her life. She just grew up, first in Canada and then in the United States, like anybody else did. And they were visiting us one night, and my brother and I, were watching Julia. And she stepped into the living room, and she watched for a little while. My grandmother, who would never want to see anybody mistreated, watched that show for a few minutes and then said this: I don't know why they have to be in everything. Now, where did she learn that? From your mother. And that was one of the places where I began to realize that word they is very significant. When we start using the word they too much, we may be expressing an attitude towards others that we have picked up. And that's why I like to say to you, there is no they, there's only us. Let me tell you about Gilbert. Gilbert was a nerdy little kid like me, going to an inner city Baltimore high school like me. And one of the things that was important for nerdy little kids in inner city Baltimore to do was to find some way to avoid being in gym class. It was no place for little guys. And Gilbert and I managed to land jobs in the gym office where we didn't really do anything except hide from the extremely violent basketball games that were going on in the gym. So Gilbert and I had a lot of time, and we talked a lot. And Gilbert lived somewhere in town, and he was black, and Gilbert and I became good friends. But we had different ideas about things. And I was saying, because by now it's 1970, and I was saying to him, the problem with racism is over. It's not, we don't have segregated schools anymore, although we did. We don't have segregated businesses anymore, although we did. I was saying that we've really solved this problem, Gilbert. It's time to let it go. And then Gilbert just started to talk to me about the racism that he had experienced, about the places he knew he was not allowed to go, about, and I remember this specifically, store clerks who would not put his change in his hand but laid it on the counter because they didn't want to make physical contact with him. He talked to me about the things that were said to him as he was walking along the street, and as he talked about these things, he began to cry. And there I was living what at the time was a privileged white life, even in the inner city Baltimore. I didn't realize it. Gilbert made me see it. It wasn't over yet. But somehow I had thought it was. Where did I get that idea? Now, this next one, let me see. Yeah, this next one happened more recently. I was talking with a friend, and we were talking about the issue of race. And he was saying, you know, there's a difference between being a racist and just noticing the differences between the races. And I agree with that. And he said, for example, it's not a racist thing to say that man has dark skin. That man, those people have darker skin than us. He says that's not racist to say. And I agreed. And then I got thinking about it. He didn't say, when he said those people have dark skin, he means as opposed to normal skin. Let me illustrate this for you. Have you ever said, well, when I was in the hospital, I had a female nurse? You never said that, right? What have you said? When I was in the hospital, I had a male nurse, right? If a nurse is male, we've got to point that out. Why? Because we all know the truth. Nurses are females, right? So you either have a nurse or you have a female nurse. You are either a rap singer or a white rap singer, because one of them is normal and one of them is not. And when you say they have dark skin, that means what? That white is normal in our minds. If you just look at the world, you will find out that we are not the majority. Those of us who are melatonin disadvantaged, as one person said to me. The fact is, when we look out at the world, we tend to identify ourselves as normal and others as different. And when we do that, that's the whole idea. That's where that comes from. That's where that racism gets into us from somewhere else, and we don't recognize it. So let me tell you about, you can't see it very well, about me. Schindler's List. Who saw that movie? Okay. Was it upsetting? Yeah. So I went to see the movie. I'm sitting there at the end of the movie, and the movie's come to an end, and I am just devastated. I am blown away by what I have seen. It was so emotionally powerful and strong. I just couldn't hardly move. I just sat there in my seat and stared at the screen in front of me. And then, behind me, two women started talking. Now, I was on Long Island, so they started talking with a Long Island accent, and they began to talk about, oh, I didn't like that movie very much, did you? And the other one said, no, I didn't like it either. And then they began to complain about the movie and about the theater and the fact that the popcorn wasn't very good. And then they went on to talk about where they were going to go shopping. And I listened to their accents, and I listened to the things that they said, and I thought to myself, what is wrong with these Jewish women behind me? I was sitting at Schindler's List and had an anti-Semitic thought. I didn't know if they were Jewish or not. I just heard the way they talked and made that assumption. I didn't even know what they looked like. They were sitting behind me. And yet that thought popped right into my head within seconds of having seen the end of that movie. Where did that come from? Where did that come from? It was in the air I breathed. And that's the situation that we have to deal with. Jesus grew up with that and somehow was able to get away from it and meet this Samaritan woman sitting at the well that Ray read about. A woman that he shouldn't be talking to, a Samaritan woman that he shouldn't be talking to, and a woman whose social life was of such a kind that he shouldn't be talking to her according to everyone else. And when Jesus looked at her, what did he see? He saw a human being. He didn't see a woman. He didn't see a Samaritan. He didn't see somebody whose life wasn't working out. He just looked at her and saw somebody who needed a word, who needed a touch, who needed in some way what he had to offer. How did he lose that? How did he manage that? Because it says that when his disciples came back, we didn't read this part, but when his disciples came back and saw him talking to this woman, they were shocked. They were so shocked, they didn't even know what to say. They just sat down and quietly kind of looked at each other and, shuffled their feet. They didn't want to, they didn't, even after traveling with Jesus, still had that prejudice, that fear of those who are different in them. And we do too. We do too. We are going to have some struggles in this country in the future for us. I wish it was going to be a matter of us just being nice to each other. But it isn't going to be that. It isn't going to be enough to just be nice to each other. We're going to have to actually take stock of the fact that we are breathing this racism and all the other kinds of prejudices that we are. And there are many. We're breathing that in. We are seeing all of this change in attitudes towards how women are to be treated in the workplace. It's all over the news right now. Where did that come from? It's been part of us, and we've been breathing that in, and we have to learn to put that away and move it away. Thank God that the grace of Christ is in us, making us uncomfortable with where they are, making us uncomfortable with where we are, and making us want to change. How many of you have been made uncomfortable by this sermon today? If you have been, that may just be a sign that the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, is working with you. Amen.
You've been listening to a sermon by Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, you're invited to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, starting at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to Steve's sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC, where you'll find the video version of Steve's sermons as well. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day. May God's blessings rest upon you now and always. See you next week.